You know, I understand well.
Most people don't think when I tell them what the downsides of everything. I didn't know you were going to like that.
So, 7:30,
Well, we get on to work from
Well, it's the Randall's, Randall.
Alright, roll call please. For the most part, that's no problem.
such a good one.
Ms. Copp? Yes. Here.
Mr. Hurst?
Here.
Mr. Horn?
Here.
Ms. Metz? Here. Mr. Tracy?
Here.
Mr. Dornan?
Dorman.
Sorry.
The spelling throws you, I know.
Mayor Miller?
And Miller is absent tonight, so I'll be stepping in for him.
All right.
Now that everyone's here, the first thing we have is the paving update with Service Director.
Just a quick update, as you guys know, paving, whenever we get I do the in-house estimate, then we get the bids, and we're usually under on the bids, so therefore we have some money to play with, and if we need to go out and do a radius, or if we need to add more base. Well, this year, the paving came in high, for obvious reasons. It's made of oil and hydrocarbons, and concrete is super expensive right now. So we budgeted 210. It came in with the milling, paving, tack code, traffic control, came in at 184.50. The ADA ramps came in at 1,800, and I'm sorry, this is my in-house estimate. And then I estimated 1,250 for Frederick Garland Road paint striping, which we may be able to save some money there because the township has agreed to do their section. So it's a joint project, so we can share that cost and hopefully offset a little bit there. So my total in-house estimate was 203.4. It came in, the sealed bid amounts came in at 194,670 for paving and 30,000 for the ramps, mainly because of the concrete costs. So the total sealed bid amount was 224,670. So we were about 14,670 over budget, which going back to say 10 years, that's roughly probably what we tend to go over on paving after we make corrections and things. So I was just gonna see what your guys' thoughts were. I don't want to say we're behind in paving because we're up. I mean, we've got two big projects that me and Jeff are still discussing how the best way to handle the two. These are going to be total recons, but after the passer ratings, I was able to set up a pretty solid plan, I think, for 5 years. And it's not that I don't want to get behind on paving, but I don't want to get behind on our plan. So one way to offset the cost would be to postpone one alley. I believe there's one alley left in town that wasn't paved. And the biggest problem with the alley is it's a drainage problem. So we do a process called inverted pavement and add a catch basin to take some of the drainage away. It's coming from Main Street to Miami. We can explore other ways to offset that issue and save about between $500 and $7,500 there. And then, so that would put us over by 94.70, or a total of 219,470. But what I would also say is some of the areas where we may, in some years, maybe go out farther into intersections and things like that, we could easily cut back and maybe hit those on the next round when maybe asphalt prices go down. So I just kind of wanted to just let you guys know that we're not under this year, and we're a little bit over, which will make us extremely mindful when they're doing. They give us all their tickets, all their load tickets. We calculate at the end down to the ton of asphalt, down to the square yard of milling. Not that we're.
I would just add one other comment. Certainly, Mr. Harris has done an excellent job of managing this project. What I would simply suggest is, as we actually get into the construction, that I would like to give him the flexibility to manage the project in that it makes sense to make cuts to keep us under budget, please do so. But also, if it's more cost effective to do some other pieces while they're there. And I trust his judgment. So I think we'll do it within budget, but if for some reason we're not, we can find the funds, and will only be when it makes sense to do so.
Yeah. We know what happens when you get behind and try to catch up. It's twice as expensive.
We're gonna talk about that later in the meeting.
Sure we have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hager.
Sure. Next thing on the list is water tower maintenance update.
This one I thought it'd be easier if I just gave you guys a handout. That way you can kind of see. I'll give you an extra one, I'm not sure.
I don't want extra.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So, in 2017, 2018, we refurbed the exteriors of the north and south water tower, which was a great move. It wasn't the best thing at the time because maybe it wasn't planned 100%, but it needed done. So going back to about 8 months ago, we had a very small leak on the standpipe in the north water tower. That has a humongous amount of head pressure coming down that pipe, so if it's even a pinhole, it's a leak. So we clamped it. We went ahead and started taking off some of the insulation because on the inside the standpipe is all insulated. The pipe did not look very good at the bottom of the tower, and about halfway up it started getting a little better and a little better. So it sounds like the condensation was staying down at the bottom of the tower. So one of the companies that is really well known for giving good, honest inspections was Pittsburgh Tank and Tower Group. So I brought them out to do an inspection on everything but pretty much the work that was done on the south tower in 17 and the north tower in 18. Now keep in mind the north tower is about, I think it's 30 years old. So what we came back with is the fill pipe starting at the base elbow up to the bowl. After the original pipe was removed, and a pipe with the same dimensions would need to be put in. The thickness of the steel was not good. It was considered a critical deficiency in the tower. I asked them to do a complete inspection on the tower while they were out, just to make sure we weren't going to be missing anything. In other words, we weren't going to bring them out to do one thing that turned into another, that turned into another. So I asked for a complete inspection. I went through and took out things that we can absolutely do in-house. Signage, tag welding bolts, these sorts of things. My crews can do no problem. A lock up at the top hatch, things like that. But there were some critical things. The fill pipe would be a necessity. We've since put 3 stainless steel, 12-inch stainless steel repair clamps on there. Those are around $800 a piece right now. We'll be able to reuse them, but if we have to buy more, that's $800 more. So I would recommend highly that we look at replacing that fill pipe. The other critical would be the roof vent on the top has gone. It's just not in good shape, so it's letting in exterior components. So that would be number 2. The flapper valve on the pipe elbow, I put that in here at $19.95. I would like to price that ourselves because we may be able to do that cheaper. And then lastly, the slope, the floor tank, they can't put a robotic cleaner in there, and the tower would have to be drained anyway to make these repairs. So it would just make sense to do a complete disinfection and clean out while the tank's empty, because what we do is we use all the water out of the tank we possibly can into the system, then we shut it down and do a final drain on it. The only other thing I had on that is that while they're here, this to me can be done now, it can be done later. Would be if you guys, I just wanted you to take a look at the north tower. If you haven't seen it, it's starting to get some moss and algae and stuff built up on the outside, again, mainly because the water gets hot, it gets cold. So basically the summary was, this would be a sealed bid project, for one. Of course, Pittsburgh Tank, I'm sure, would bid it, and maybe bid it cheaper than the pricing they've given us. I've already located another company that would bid it, and I would hope to find at least a third. If we did the critical infrastructure work, again, maybe minus that flapper valve, we would be at around 61.6. If we did the tank wash at the same time, we would be at 81,375. And then I put a follow-up to that, and in 2023 and beyond, we should get into an inspections and repair annual contract for both the towers. It had been discussed in years past, and I know that it is somewhat cost-driven, but at this point, it would be better to really think about doing that than to getting into these situations. And frankly, if it hadn't started leaking, under that insulation, we wouldn't have known that it was faulty or it had issues anyway. So of course this isn't budgeted for. So I guess my hope would be, even if we take the exterior tank wash off and bid it, maybe we come in closer to 50. And then if we keep the tank wash on it, which I would recommend washing it, mainly because after a while that will start to deteriorate. It's got a seal coat, for lack of better terms, and that algae will eat into that seal coat, and then all the paint will go faster unless you keep it clean. So
Did they paint the inside of those tanks the last time?
yeah, the inside, and I do have a report. Anybody is welcome to see it. The inspection report I didn't print out because it would have been like hundreds of pages. The tower is in structurally extremely good condition. And if you can go to a 30-year-old water tower and find these things as your critical issues, that's really not bad. It was actually, the company that did it, Horizon Brothers, did a good job. The tank itself it's structurally in very good shape. It's just, the standpipe didn't test out maybe as bad in 17, or 16, but,
So
yeah.
when you talk about pressure washing, the $20,000 pressure washing, and now versus later, that was what was painted just 5 years ago.
Yes.
So we're not kicking something overdue down the road, but more of a question of truly do it now while we're in there, or ride it a little bit longer.
yes. We're gonna get a cheaper price if we bid it and they're already there.
Yeah, they're already boots on the ground, but whether it's really needed or not at this point is more the
Wouldn't
question.
have to be done this year. I mean, we could get by, if we wanted to say we went into we would put out, interview companies for our maintenance contracts, and what you do is you pay an X amount of dollars each year, and they tell you exactly what they're gonna do each year for the next 10 years, and therefore it's budgeted, it's on track, and you won't find any surprises. I mean, we could skip the wash for now. I don't think a year is gonna make that big a difference on that. I mean, it's not terrible.
On a regular, how often does that get done?
It should be washed, I think, every 3 to 4 years. Like, I got online and pulled up some maintenance matrix contracts, and so usually washout and stuff, exteriors are every third year is when they typically do exterior washing.
So didn't we finish painting those in 18?
So we're there.
And so by emergency on these other two items, is that like next week emergency or 6 months from now emergency?
I would say if council approves it, then we do a bid out. It takes, maybe we do a 3-week bid out, and there may be some questions in between. I would say that we could get by coming into early summer, but I wouldn't really want to go too far past that.
30-year-old towers, how often have we been power washing the outside of the door?
We've never really had them on a maintenance contract. So the north and south tower, when they were refurbed in 17 and 18, were more or less the first time they've been done for probably 15 to 18 years before that. The north tower never really had any major maintenance.
It was the worst, wasn't it?
Yeah. South tower, really the two towers, I gotta tell you, they're really in good shape. It's just a matter of these,
Keeping
nothing's cheap anymore. I mean,
Well, I think that one of those maintenance contracts would cost per year.
I mean, usually, like, if you're going with two towers like our towers, they could be in these, they could start out in, okay, so it always depends on what needs done. If the towers are up to date, then they may start out pushing maybe $25,000 per year. But that would get you an interior, a visual washout, in total inspections, and you know, any work estimates ahead of time so that you could plan ahead of time. I'm just kind of pulling that figure because the numbers that we've seen on things this year coming out of COVID are highly skewed, and I hope that they will return to normal somewhat. But my guess would be 20 to 30, maybe per tower annually to keep them 100% functionable all the time. And I always look at it lastly as a water loss thing also. The less you have to drain them, because that water going out is money, you know, we're losing to, you know, work on the towers. And so you don't have to drain the tower to pressure wash it. So again, that's not a showstopper. And it would save us from emergency money. But again, it's going to be more expensive probably if we wait. So
And we didn't have any of this in the budget, did we?
that is correct. And of course, it started leaking about, what, probably a month or so after budget
After the-
season.
Yeah. Next year's budget will have it. I think we'd like to strongly consider getting on maintenance contracts once those towers.
It was one of those 6 a.m. calls. Hey, man, there's something going on up here.
How do we even detect that? Just
We go,
here?
they inspect it every day. They're up inside the towers and stuff.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
so they go in to check. But it was cold out, the heat lamps and all the equipment, make sure it's dry, and they were like, oh, there's a sprinkler in here. So my guy, I'll tell you what, I will tell you this, they got the tallest step ladder I've ever seen and put clamps on. They hold that thing, they borrowed it somewhere, I don't even know where they got it,
Why? That
and
was
clamped
scary.
it. But once they got to that point, they're like, I don't think we can go any higher, so.
Picturing some of our guys doing that, one ladder on top of another.
Get it? I got it.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, it's not great news, but I was happy to see when the inspection report came back how well the tower really was, so.
What did our reefer cost?
I would have to pull that, I don't remember now, it was,
I almost feel like, wasn't it $1 million? It
It was like 700 and
was
some thousand
really close.
to refurb both of them, or it was gonna be like over $1 million to
Yeah.
build a new one.
all I remember is they cut us they cut us a break because they finished that one, kept their stuff here, and then as soon as the weather broke, then they went right to that one, so they cut us a deal for storing their equipment and all that. So we saved a little bit, but I don't remember what it cost.
To me, that dollar amount really makes the maintenance contract seem more reasonable.
Right.
You know, or the replacement cost, being over $1 million makes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben.
No problem.
Next on the agenda, we have Chief Doyle Wright with Fire and Works Legislation.
We actually have in your packet a copy of the chief's letter, as well as copies of correspondence from the fire chief and the law director.
Thank you. Recently, Mr. Sheridan, myself, and Chief Jay with the Fire Division received an email from Lene Broche, our law director, and she was updating us on a bill that was passed out of the Ohio House last fall. The Ohio legislation passed House Bill 172 in the fall of 2021, allowing consumer-grade fireworks to be used by anyone starting July 1st of this year for the following holidays: New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, Cinco de Mayo, Juneteenth, Memorial Day weekend, Labor Day weekend, July 3rd, 4th, and 5th, as well as the 3-day weekends before and after July 4th, Chinese New Year, and Diwali. Governor DeWine last year had been presented a bill that was passed through the House that he vetoed. And he went on to say that he wasn't thrilled with either bill when they came across his desk, the one last year or this year. However, he said, "I think if you know that I'm not in favor of expanding the use of fireworks in the state of Ohio by amateurs. However, I didn't sign this bill and legislation. Had he not signed it, they would have been able to go back in the House and override his veto on the original bill, which was much more broad than this bill. So the one that they originally passed last year, he vetoed. They came back after he had made some recommendations for changes that he'd like to see in this. The nice thing is that the legislators have written an opportunity for us to opt out of this. And a lot of communities across Ohio have already passed local ordinances doing just that. And many of them cite the same reasons I'm going to tell you this evening as to why I don't feel that we should allow this to occur here. How do we handle the noise complaints for a lawful act? That's a big concern of mine. We already get a number of complaints, and the current law has been in effect since 1972 for no fireworks. And we still answer a number of calls just over the 4th of July holiday and around New Year's every year. So allowing this to occur is just going to kick those up. It allows nearly a month's worth of fireworks over the 12-month period. So if you add all those days up, almost a whole month over the year, you're going to hear fireworks going off. I also am concerned about the proximity of the closeness of the homes in our community. We don't have, a lot of times the houses are very close to each other within just 10, 15 feet for people to be shooting off fireworks. I'm concerned about the injuries of those inexperienced or those using alcoholic beverages or others. We'll get a number of barking dog complaints. Those will go up. Potential damage complaints from residents for their homes being damaged. The trash left behind is a concern of mine as well. And then setting off the fireworks in the public street and leaving that trash behind. Overall, I think it's going to cause a strain on public safety, ourselves, the EMS, and the fire. And the current fireworks law, as I said, has been in place since 1972. It still puts a strain on us for our safety sources at least a couple times a year that I mentioned. However, I think the new law is going to require us to have additional personnel on those holidays based on this complaint, the new law. One of the biggest concerns in this law is the fire safety aspect of it. As mentioned before, the homes in West Milton are near each other. Fireworks going wrong or they've gone wrong will set a house on fire quickly and maybe multiple under the new law. So my recommendation is that we'd opt out and enact a municipal ordinance before July the 1st that kind of mirrors what the current law is, not allowing it in our communities. That's not going to keep them from going out in the township and shoot them off if they choose, but within our municipality, they would not be able to shoot the fireworks off. So I bring that to your attention because I think if with your blessing, we would work with Ms. Brosh and draft some legislation or an ordinance to bring to you addressing the new law, and that we're opting out of that so we can have something in place before the holiday weekend of July 4th. Any questions? I think you'll also find that Chief Jay agrees with my recommendation as well. He and I did not discuss it openly. I knew that he had talked with Mr. Sheridan about this and that he shared the same concerns I did. So I didn't actually call him because I knew we were kind of on the same page already.
My question might be, for Ms. Brush, that can we partially opt out so we can use the parts that we want?
You can do anything. I don't think the law is specific enough to say that you can't enact your own. Obviously, they're making it much broader, so anything less, I think, is where you could be in between that. Do you have an idea of what you're talking about?
Well, I'm thinking around Independence Day, or a couple days around that, or a long weekend, or whatever, we could let people do what they want to do, and the rest of the year I can see how it might be more nuisance complaints because people don't know what you're
My only concern with that is if we open the door and allow that to occur over a holiday weekend, as a resident, I'd say, what's the problem with the others? If you're saying fire is an issue, injury is an issue, because we're still gonna have those issues on those holidays. That would be my only rebuttal to that. I mean, obviously, as council, you can do what you choose, but, my recommendation would be to stay where we are, because we still hear a lot of fireworks. Typically, how we handle those complaints, and we have always, even though the law's been in effect since 1972, rarely do we cite someone. The last time I can remember citing someone was a 15-year-old young man in the summer last year for letting him off in the daytime. They got numerous complaints, and while sitting in front of the house trying to figure out where they were coming from, he let off another one. So it wasn't hard for me to figure it out. Which scared the bejeebies out of me, sitting in front of the house trying to figure this out. Typically, we go warn the people, knock it off, and then if we return, they get cited. That's been our standard operating procedure, unless there is mitigating circumstances. Obviously, if they set them off and set their neighbor's house on fire, that's not a warning. But if it's just them merely shooting off a few small fireworks in the backyard, as long as they cease it, that's usually what we do with them.
1% increase, you'd be looking at something like a 16% increase, so roughly $7 per month increase. A couple things to think about. The challenge is, or one of the questions is, well, how quickly will those customers come on? So all that revenue is not going to be here tomorrow. That's going to take some time, so that's something to think about in terms of when that new revenue will actually come on. The other driving factor I just kind of want to circle back is going back to when we're looking at your loan and your debt payments that are out there, we're seeing those rolling off. So right now they're at $150,000. After 2023, that goes down to $79,000, etc. So we have sort of a moving target here because of those factors. So what we would have the village consider is instead of considering implementing like a one-time 16% or going with a one-time 31%, is to look at phasing potential multi-phase increase in over time. And what that would do is obviously it would generate the revenue needed to at least cover your existing costs, but also recognize that you're going to be bringing in more revenue over time. So the remaining schedule, most of the remaining schedules, what we did is we prepared sort of a futuristic cash flow, which is kind of in the form of a graph there. But what we looked at is implementing, like a three-phase rate adjustment. Again, this can change, but it's just it's an option, is to look at, perhaps for, the first phase is looking at maybe doing a 9% increase, and then follow that up with, maybe a smaller increase, like a 4%, 23, and maybe another 4%, 24. Again, just to recognize that there's additional revenue that's going to be coming in. So if we were to kind of distill it all down, what are we seeing here? What is our recommendation? There likely needs to be some adjustment to be considered to meet future costs. But the decision as to whether, what that number is, what that increase is, really depends on the council's, I think, thought in terms of how quickly will this development happen, and how fiscally conservative do you want to be. Because obviously before that revenue comes on, if these costs play out like we're estimating here, you would be eating into some of your existing cash reserves, and so you wouldn't want to do that for too long. You could get away with that for a little while, but you wouldn't want to do that for very long. So the other thing I wanted to share with you, and then happy to answer any questions you have, is back on page 19, so the last page. One of the questions we commonly get is, you know, how do our rates compare to our neighbors or other, you know, surrounding communities? And so this information here kind of reflects that. And by the way, these dollar amounts, these are estimated monthly bills. This is based on 7,500 gallons, which is probably higher than what most people use. But it still gives you a sense of kind of where you might rank compared to some of your peers here. So, you know, current rates, assuming you use 7,500 gallons, the monthly bill is $63.93. That's highlighted there in the middle. And then you can kind of see how you compare to some of the other communities. So sort of somewhere in the middle compared to those other selected communities.
So where you have us in the middle, at the current on page 19, that's, and then the other yellow bars is our estimated future.
They would be, yep, assuming that you do sort of that phased-in approach that I mentioned, you know, where like the first phase would be like a 9% and then a 4%, 4%. That's where you would end up with those proposed rates, correct?
And that assumes no rate increases by any municipalities.
Correct.
And that's not taking into account the contractor Troy, correct?
That's correct. It's not taking into account the water tower that we talked about, it's not taking into account the wastewater treatment plant, not taking into account if we pursue an alternate source of water.
All major factors.
All major factors.
So, yep, which could dramatically change the sort of the overall recommendation.
So, question for either of you, and this is more out of ignorance than anything, on page 10, where you guys build it on line 7, the 19,932, that's taken into account the assumption that the $1.6 million in total loans over the next 30 years is at 0% loans for those OPWC or OWPC, whatever it is, loans. Do those change with inflation? Or those are always, that's a constant, we'll always have access to that money at that rate? Okay.
Well, yeah, so so the ones you have outstanding are fixed.
Well, what about
going
future?
forward?
Sure.
That's what I'm wondering. I mean, if I had to
Future
buy
they could
my
change.
house today at rates from the 1990s, I wouldn't buy it at 13%. I'd be, you know.
But you bring up an interesting point, and Mr. Sheridan and I were kind of touching on this before the meeting. You all are familiar, I'm sure, or heard about, you know, the Infrastructure Investment Act that was passed. And so each state will be getting a significant amount of funding from the federal government over the next 5 years. And much of those dollars will be set aside, both grant and loan money, for water infrastructure projects and sewer infrastructure projects. So if there's any time that you're looking to do a project, now is a good time to do it, starting this fiscal year. Because the state of Ohio is going to be getting a significant amount of money through the Ohio EPA SREP program. And that will continue over the next 5 years. So if there are projects that you're thinking about, and you're thinking about financing those projects, you know, now would be a good time to apply for those funds, to get those funds in the queue, or get in the queue for the program and to get access to those funds.
And is that line 7, is that a low buffer built in there on page 10, or is that just a number you guys normally plug in?
Yeah, you know what, I would say that's probably a little bit low now. We usually use 2 or 3%, and when we started preparing this, we were still 2 or 3% inflation. Now we're closer to 7?
Right.
So yeah, it might be a little bit low at this point.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Any other questions?
Yeah, on page 14, we get the columns and trying to show us how Doyle Crossing changes things. I'm not sure I understand outstanding debt service, how that's different because of Stillwater Crossing. Don't we still pay the same amount of money?
Yeah, good. Yep, good point. and I brushed over that, or I didn't cover that. So what we've assumed is that, under that Stillwater crossing scenario, that it would take a couple years, a year or two down the road until kind of all those connections are in, or they're actually connected to the system. So if we take 2 years into account, we're past 2023, which is after a couple of those loans roll off. And so instead of assuming $150,000 for total combined bond payments, we assume the lower amount, 71, which is the annual payment that you would see after 2023. So we're just assuming that we're a couple years down the road in that scenario. So that's where that
As
number
opposed to current.
Yep, as opposed to current, right?
It's a timing issue, not any other benefit from Stillwater crossings.
Correct, correct.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Mr. Vogel, yes, Mr. Vogel, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, so assuming with this whole study and plan that's done, this is all based on our current situation with our water, continuing to purchase that through Troy. This does not take into consideration anything with any plans or anything in the works with another possible water source, correct?
Correct.
That's correct. This was an initial evaluation looking at capital improvements that already had in the works, but we've somewhat adjusted those and brought them current. So based on today, all other things being equal, these are the projects we know that we would do. But just as I listed, a new wastewater treatment plant, the tower improvements that Mr. Herron described earlier, there are lots of variables that we know are going to come to fruition that are not plugged into this study.
So this really is intended to be, a baseline study, and from this point on, as the village progresses, starts looking at some of those other options, whatever those might be, you can modify this study, assuming, it's not 3-5 years down the road or too long, but you can modify this study and add in different scenarios, looking at, okay, well, what if we were to maybe forego purchasing wholesale water, or build our own plant, or purchase it from someone else. You can kind of run those what-if scenarios based on this information.
Anyone else? Ready to move forward? Ready to take on the sewage works?
All right, so we'll switch gears. Sewer report. So just a little bit of historical context, like I shared on the water. Similar situation with the sewage works. Again, the good news is over the last several years you haven't eroded your cash, or the sewage works hasn't seen an erosion in cash. You've actually seen cash build up a little bit, which is a good thing. And in terms of revenues, we've seen those remain fairly constant. Again, we didn't see a big drop off due to the pandemic, which is positive news. And in terms of operating expenses, we saw that we have seen sort of an increase in operating costs, but not anything that's overly alarming. It's more just general increases in operating costs. So again, just kind of starting with the cash position on page 2. And I'll kind of spare you the more in-depth description here. We'll just kind of hit the numbers here on the sewage, because a lot of the methodology is the same. It's just the numbers are different. But within the sewage works at the end of the year, there was 1.8 million, almost 1.9 million dollars in cash. Again, if we were just kind of look at what the very minimum baseline cash balances should be, as a rule of thumb, $260,000, you can see that leaves about $1.6 million in funds above that. So the sewage works is in an even greater position cash-wise than the water utility. Page 3 is just reflects your payments, they're the sewage works payments on the 2015 OWPC loan at 0%, which goes out to 2030. So paying roughly $6,500 per year on that loan. That's the only loan within the sewage works. Then on page 4, this reflects the estimated capital improvement plan for the sewage works over the next 5 years. Got items such as the sanitary sewer trunk main replacement in 2024. We've got the Wagner Street reconstruction, Cedar Plat reconstruction, which again, that was reflected on the water report as well, since there's a sharing of those project costs. And then we had a general allowance here for capital and aging infrastructure of $132,000 per year. And then down below that, again, we've just kind of made some assumptions here, assuming that some of these projects would be paid for through OWPC loans, so debt financing, and then cash on hand as well, like we talked about on the water side. So total capital needs, roughly 3.9 million. Taking out the other sources of funding to sort of distill it down to how much you pay out of cash each year, comes out to an average of about $159,000 per year. I should probably point this out, the $132,000 that you see ongoing capital and aging infrastructure, that was really just based on historical trends in terms of kind of what the sewage works had spent over the last 3.5 years. So, that would be something you'd want to take a look at if you feel like that's adequate or inadequate. Certainly that number could be adjusted.
Not to interrupt, but a big thing that I&I is going to be a big part of that infiltration. So, those numbers are probably pretty low, considering we're, one, the south trunk line, but two, trying to get rid of some of our ground infiltration going to our plant. So I see us doing more before that. So, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks for the thought there. Yeah, I mean, I&I, from what I understand, I&I is pretty high within the system. Of course, reducing that, you've got the upfront capital costs. Once that I&I is reduced, then just kind of thinking through the kind of the steps here, but how much of that then would reduce some of your operating costs too. That may be hard to quantify, but
backed up sewers, things like that, we won't have as much problem.
Sure. But to your point, obviously these numbers, we can modify these numbers. So as you're kind of thinking through that, if you feel that the $132,000 might be light, and you build in more to address I&I issues, we can certainly change those assumptions. All right. Page 5, again, this is where we're focusing on the day-to-day operating expenses. During the test year, the utility expended almost $520,000 for the year. And then you can see in the middle column, we're adjusting those line items by about $74,000. And then adjustment 6, we're also adding in that 2-3% inflationary factor there as well. So going forward, we're estimating future operating expenses to be right around $600,000 per year. Skip ahead to page 9. So similar to water, we're just again sort of bookending the scenarios here. We've got kind of what we call current operations, and then we've got the scenario that looks at the Stillwater crossing development and what kind of impact that might have. So starting with current operations, total cost taking into account day-to-day expenses, your current OPWC loan, 6,500, Bobcat lease, the proposed loan payments of 49,600, and then the capital replacement allowance of 159,000. Looking at total cost of $823,000.
Is that the same Bobcat lease on both water and sewer? Or we have two?
Yeah, it's,
Paying it out of both.
Split it,
We split it out of both? Gotcha.
one half, 50/50.
Sorry.
That's all right. Good question.
Sure, yep. Yep, so total cost, 813,000. Annual revenues coming into the sewage works, $676,000 per year. So you can see there's a shortfall there, roughly $137,000, which is about a 20% adjustment. So current sewer bill, assuming 4,000 gallon usage, currently 34.87. Under that first scenario, we'd be looking at about a $7 per month increase. Again, this doesn't take into account any major treatment plant improvements or anything like that. Just kind of current operations, if you will. Then under the Stillwater Crossings development, again, we're adding in additional revenue. You'll see under Stillwater Crossings receipts, estimating that to be about $93,000 per year. We've offset that by adding additional operating costs of $13,900, which is shown kind of towards the top of the page there. So total additional receipts or revenues required would be about $58,000, which would be about a 7.5% increase to rates. So again, similar kind of idea as we talked about on the water utility. One option, again, because you have a pretty healthy cash balance, could be to look at phasing a rate increase in over a number of years. So on the subsequent schedules, what we did is we're showing, assuming that the village increases sewer rates roughly 3.8% in two phases. So there'd be like a 3.8% in 2023, and then another 3.8% in 2024 as one option. And then in terms of rate comparison, last page, you can see kind of how you compare, very similar as what we saw on the water side. The village is somewhere in the middle in terms of sewer rates compared to your peers. And then you can see what the projected monthly bill would be, again, assuming 7,500 gallons under that phase rate scenario. You never want to be the lowest, you never want to be the highest, right? Sometimes it's good to be in the middle. Well, sometimes you want to be the lowest, but not for long, because that probably means...
It's an election year.
Yeah, it's an election year. If you're there too long, it probably means you're not spending enough money to...
So if we take both of these in, the 16% on the water and the 7.5% on the sewer, for the average 4,000 gallon a month user, we're looking at $9.55 total. That they would see an increase in more or less depending on how much you use, obviously.
Correct.
I have a question when you say we have a healthy cash balance. So how are we having such a good cash balance, but then like page 9 shows, our revenue. So our revenue is greater than our receipts, that's how we continue.
Yeah, so, well, historically, your revenues have exceeded your expenses.
We don't plan on that continuing.
Right, and I think that's really, due to the capital needs that you're anticipating, with the aging infrastructure, I&I issues, other projects that now need to be done. That's really what's making the difference. As well as some inflationary increases, but it's more driven by project needs, which is pretty common when you're looking at rate increases.
And another way to look at that too is, I just pulled up some expenditures, like for tower maintenance this year, we had $1,500, like $1,500 total for tower maintenance. Obviously, we're not gonna try to overspend what our water amounts are, and then water lines maintenance, I know we just talked about that today, 8 or 9 years ago, it was $1,200 in there a year for water lines maintenance. Currently, we have $10,000 a year, and we just had it broken down from the water line. Water maintenance costs us $18,000 to fix one valve. So, I think we're getting by, we're getting by with what we have, but we're not,
But barely.
yeah.
And that's if we have no more water breaks the rest of the year,
Not forever.
and that's not gonna happen.
The other thing I would point out too, we haven't really talked about it, again, it's kind of in my mind because of the Infrastructure Act and the dollars that are going to be coming down. Mr. Sheridan, I can't recall if we talked about this, but are there any, on the water side, any lead line
Yes.
issues that you're aware of?
Yeah, we're doing the preliminary engineering for the Miami Street project, and the number of lead lines are causing us to consider
That's right.
pushing the project to next year. There is grant funding to replace some of them. So for example, if there's a lead line from our main to the meter, my understanding is there's funding to pay for that. But there's not funding currently available, maybe in the future, is if the homeowner has lead from the meter to his house, we can't reconnect the system until that line is replaced. And that's not cheap,
And that's on the homeowner.
and that's on the homeowner, unless other funding becomes available. So at this point, we can move forward. We can't reconnect any line that we know has lead on it.
So the theory behind that is we're not gonna push water that's all lead-free and then allow you to flow it through lead pipes
Correct.
the last 20 feet or whatever.
So what I expect to happen is we'll end up delaying this project for one construction season while we put together grants to pay for our portion, and then either identify funds or at least have a better idea of how many households are we talking. Is it 10 or 100? And what kind of cost you're talking for those homeowners?
And to that point, and again, one of the big opportunities here will be through Ohio EPA as those dollars are funneled down from federal government this summer. A big chunk of those dollars are being set aside and allocated specifically for lead line replacement, and a lot of those dollars will be grant, not loan. So, good opportunity right now to, maybe not necessarily for this specific project that you're referring to, but projects over the next 5 years, there's going to be dollars available for that. So you definitely want to make sure you get in the queue for that funding.
I think it makes sense to wait, but we're gonna run the risk of another year with a 6-inch line that's 75 years old and feeds the entire downtown. It's a major line for fire. That last one more while we're trying to get the lead line issue resolved. Any other questions?
Yeah, so my concern is that, you look at the next few years and projects we're considering doing, and I did a little math, which is always dangerous to do that on the fly. But if you look at sewer and 24, 5, and 6, that's $1.6 million that we're borrowing, and that's taking out the part that is getting paid for by the water department and the streets department. That's $540,000 per year on average that we're adding to our debt. Now, some of that gets paid off as we go, but then what happens in 2027? We're gonna borrow more money, probably another $500,000 every year as we have some major project that we have to do. So if I look at our expenses and between our total expenses and how much money we borrow every year, and then compare that to how much we take in, it looks to me like we need to raise rates more like 50%. And I know that's not what people want to hear, but we got to plan more than to 2026 and then go, well, crap, now what do we do?
I'm understanding you correctly, there's 3 main projects that are replacement, Wagner Street, and Cedar Flat. And that's only 3 projects, but they're very expensive projects. My point being, that's not all the projects that we do.
And that's what I'm saying too, and by 2027, there'll be another, we have another $500,000 project we got part of it for. We're gonna, it's gonna cost, rough numbers, $500,000 in improvements every year. And
That's
so,
just what we've identified so far.
so how we fund it isn't really important, because that money has to go out every year, which means that money has to come in every year.
And knowing that, now you're gonna set rates based on your financial plan for the next 3 to 5 years, but then every 3 to 5 years, you kind of go back and you look at this again, kind of reassess, do new legislation for, say, the next 5 years. So that's kind of how we typically see it, but you're right, I mean, everything doesn't just end in 27 or 26, you're gonna have more projects. So this is gonna be a fluid process. It should be an ongoing process in terms of looking at rates, because things change and they're gonna continue to change. And I'll just mention real quick too, I said kind of 1 of 2 ways. Another way of looking at this too, which we're doing a lot with more and more with communities, is taking a longer view look. And you'll see a lot of this if you've heard about asset management planning, and I know you've kind of gone through, you might have gone through that process with, trying to identify what your future asset replacement needs are over like a longer period, 20-year period. So the idea would be to overlay sort of a financial plan or rate plan over that 20-year asset management plan to really give you a better sense of what's the long game, what's the trend in our rates going forward, looking out 20 years versus 5 years. Now, the further out you get, the foggier the crystal ball, but it gives you a better sense of kind of where your rates may trend out beyond just 5 years.
Well, I think to your point, Ray, something like addressing the current, the 9 and 4 and 4 for the next 3 years, but then continuing on past that to raise them at least the rate of inflation past that every year. Because it costs us more money to maintain it every year. So, taking that proactive approach too, instead of just leaving rates stagnant after 2 or 3 years and then forgetting about or whatever. And not addressing it that way, it continually goes and residents aren't hit with, like you're talking about, going back to the 5 years, so we need 25% more, whatever. Some kind of approach like that, I don't know what that percentage is.
And that's, as you guys know, I'm sure, that's the approach that most power companies and gas companies and, they tend to take that approach too, and that's what we're encouraging a lot of public water, sewer utilities to take that same approach, is, try to get away from, just raising rates once or twice and then not do it for a long time, till you get behind the 8 ball, but, get the customer class, or get the customers used to seeing, maybe annual or biannual increases, more frequent, hopefully lower percentage increases, but just more frequent, constant increases to keep up with increases in costs.
It's also good information to see we're in the middle of the pack as it stands. Not most expensive like we often think ourselves with it all, or whatever.
So you mentioned we need a new wastewater treatment plant.
We had a meeting with Ohio EPA, and I would suggest that there's no question you're going to need a plant at some point. The most current discussion is whether or not it makes sense to put some money into this plant and try to Band-Aid it for a few more years until we have more clarity on where the regulations are moving forward. So for example, we have an expectation that there'll be some requirements on the plant 5 years from now that are not on. But we don't want to design a plant today, not knowing for sure. In 2 months, we renew our NPDES permit, is that correct? And it's my understanding, this is not always true in other states, but once we lock in that permit, they won't come back and make changes until closer to the end of that 5 years. So, yes, you're gonna need a new plant. What's still undetermined is whether that's start designing it today or mandate for a couple of years and then start designing. Is that accurate, Ben?
Yep.
And that would be another one of these capital improvement projects.
I'm sorry?
That would be another one of these
That would be another,
outside
yes,
of the
yes, it
trunk
would.
thing
Yes, it
and
would.
the flag.
There are several components. UV, the plant was designed to have 2 runs of UV, but when you outfitted it, you only paid for 1. So we've got 1 sitting there empty, that we're probably gonna have to charge and start using.
Bring it online.
Bring it online, thank you. There's several factors. We'll have another work session where we're talking specifically about the wastewater treatment.
Well, as he was given those numbers, what was going through my mind is, what is a healthy debt balance for a community of our size to carry? We have a fixed amount of money incoming, and that stays pretty routine, but, I mean, these are, to say 500,000 every year for ever, just seems so crazy.
That's a good question.
And I don't know what a healthy balance is for a community our size.
Sure, yeah, no, I mean, that's a very common question, we get that a lot. The way I would answer that, it's different than if we were to look at it from the private sector or personal, as far as what's our debt load. Obviously, there can be a point where there's too much debt load, but in the public sector, what we find is it really more or less comes down, it's less about it's less about debt load, and it becomes more about what's the customer's ability to absorb rate increases. Because if you think about the flip side to issuing debt, the benefit of the debt is we're spreading those costs over a longer period of time, which generally means you can keep your rates lower. The flip side of that is if we're not taking out debt, that means we're going to pay for it out of cash on hand.
Right, which,
so
again, it's like spending your savings versus having a car payment.
Or you got to build more in per year into your rates so that you can pay for those projects, which generally tends to jack your rates up. So it's, when I see municipalities, I work with a lot of municipalities that have debt, that question comes up a lot, and it's a good question. But in my opinion, it's less about, I don't have a concern about taking on more debt as long as your customers have the ability to pay their sewer and water rates.
Because when you went over both these packets, there was a sense of pride when you went to the variance sheet on what we have versus what you guys recommend. That made me feel really good.
Like to start with good news, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And as we forecast this, I mean, we can historically look at what household income is in our community and what burden they can bear, but I mean, the households we're adding in the new development aren't typical to our town. I mean, they're somewhere in the neighborhood, based just on being able to qualify for the loans on this home, probably double or more of the household income of existing residents. I mean, so the more we grow that, I mean, that changes the picture too. But that's a lot of things.
Yeah, and the more you can grow, generally speaking, the better off you are, as long as you're not having to expand your facilities. But if you can take on growth and have growth pay for growth, that's when you're really in a better situation. What we see a lot tends to be where you've got a community where it's very stagnant, there's not much growth, but you have rising costs, and so your rates just keep going up and up and up. Well, the only way to really offset that or mitigate that is if you continue to bring in, new development, which sounds like you're doing that.
That's hands out in both these studies, I think.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. So, sewer looks like it's, as far as cash is in a better position because we've got a bunch of money in the bank. So, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I also noticed we only have one loan, which is good, but the other thing that's good is we probably have that loan because it's at 0%. So, would we take that money and just pay for future projects out of that, or do we take loans for it?
So to your first question, yeah, I would say it's a good thing, absolutely, to have that level of cash in hand. And again, that's another common question, and it's a good question. How much is too much? I'm an accountant, so you can't have too much, in my opinion. And the reason I say that, I don't mean to be glib, but the reason I say that is there's so many future capital needs. You know, we talked about the plant. That would cost way more than 1.6 million. So you know that looking ahead, the capital needs that you have are going to far outweigh the amount of cash that you have right now. But having that cash there, having it in reserve for emergencies and capital projects that we've talked about over the next 5 years, I mean, that's what you want to see. And as sort of as a side, you know, if you ever do have to access bonding through the open market, maybe, you know, something other than a state agency, you know, you're going to want to show the bond market that you have good healthy cash reserves. That's something that they're going to look at. So you haven't had to worry about that. Other communities do, but you know, that's something that would be a bonus in terms of, you know, getting access to good low interest rates.
And then one more question follow up with that, and this might be a little bit more in depth, but does having that cash affect our ability to get grants to pay for things?
No,
No, so
not that I'm aware of in Ohio. I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yeah,
No, go ahead. Yeah. No, I agree. And especially with the, again, I know I keep going back to this Infrastructure Act, but it is a game changer. There will be emphasis. EPA is emphasizing grants, not just only to distress, but primarily to financially distressed communities. But the definition of distress doesn't necessarily take into account cash. It's really looking at household income and your rates and the ability of your ratepayers to pay their rates.
that's the bigger variable, the rates. The higher the rates, the easier it is to get the grant, because that's an indication of that you tried to maintain your system and you need it. Well, it's amazing how many communities are proud that they've kept their rates really low, their system's in terrible shape, and then they don't understand why they can't get grants, because you haven't raised your rates in a long time. Your rates are too low. They're artificially low, and you're not taking care of your system. So by having high rates, you show that you're doing everything you can to try to maintain the system as well as you can. And it won't change overnight. You've gone years under one philosophy of fixing it rather than proactively making it. So it takes time to get that switch. And over time, whether it will show up easily on one of these studies, it'll be less expensive to proactively maintain it than will to fix it every time it breaks.
You know, just looking over all these studies, obviously we're gonna have to raise rates. But I think it's just gonna be really important for us to communicate to the citizens. I just keep thinking how we're gonna have a lot of town hall meetings and whatnot to show them, hey, we have to maintain stuff and.
This is just the beginning of the conversation.
Well, I think I shared with you when I came and talked with you, is, you know, we gotta have some kind of campaign on educating homeowners on how they can curb their household usage. You know, I don't know how many old-fashioned 10-gallon toilets we have flushing in this town, but, you know, there's that little trick of putting a 2-liter in there to displace some of the water, and, you know, you save 2 gallons on every flush, you know, doing other things just to reduce consumption, health leaks, things like that. But when I see a solidly in the middle of the pack and some of the good news in here, I can't help but thank Ben. He's the only one who's been here long enough to
Yes.
to say thank you to.
I would agree. Any other questions? Mr. Rowdy, you have to do closing what would be the next step in writing our fiscal utility ship?
Yeah, yeah. So, really the next step would be for, to get comfortable with the numbers and the assumptions in there, in the report. Maybe do a follow-up meeting amongst the council, that would be special session or public session, and, talk about what the appetite is or desire for, rate adjustments. I think that would be the next step. And like I said, if, as you're going through that, if you see something, we need to build in this, we'd like to build in this tower maintenance contract since we're here doing this now. We can make some minor modifications to it if you need us to. But really, it's just getting, absorb the numbers in there and start talking about what the rate plan would look like going forward. And then obviously start the process of educating the public, which you said which is an important piece of that. I think it really helps to have, obviously a study or something that you can point to and say this is what the numbers are showing us. This is the plan, to really solidify that with the public. So I think that's the next step. Let us know if you have any questions as you're going through it. Again, any other changes or modifications that we need to make, we can do that.
What about taking a look at tap fees?
So tap fees, couple comments on that, and Mr. Sheridan and I have talked about that. Tap fees, let's start with this. When we talk about tap fees, we want to make sure we define kind of what we're talking about, because when one person says tap fee, another person says connection fee, another person says availability fee, another person says, like me, system development fee, and all those things can mean different things, or they can mean the same thing. So I'm going to use terms that I'm familiar with. So I'm going to say, I'm going to call it a tap fee, okay? So in my mind, what a tap fee is it's the cost or the charge that you would charge a new customer that's tapping into the system to physically connect to the system. So it would be the customer paying for the meter, or I don't know if you do your own taps, the cost of actually tapping them in, your labor, your materials, everything that it costs to do that. In my mind, that's what I kind of define as a tap fee. Okay. The other fee that we talk about, which is commonly called a connection fee or system development fee or availability fee, kind of goes back to the concept that we mentioned a minute ago, and that is having growth pay for growth. And so what that fee attempts to do is that when you have, for example, a new development that's coming in, you have an established fee that you charge them for when they connect into the system. And I'll call it a system development fee because that's what I'm used to calling it. But it would be based on their connection size, so their meter size. And that's, if you think about it, that's tied to the amount of capacity that they're then taking into your system or you're reserving into the system. The idea behind that is as you collect those dollars, then you set that money aside into an improvement fund or capital fund. And those dollars then are reserved, they could be used for other things, but in theory, those dollars are reserved for future expansion costs. So, we talked about like the wastewater treatment plant. Or let's say you have, for example, another area that you want to develop. You can take those dollars and use those dollars to extend service to another area, right? So the idea behind it is as you expand your system, you're incurring costs, but you're offsetting at least a portion of those costs from connection fees or system development fees that you're collecting from new customers, so that you're not putting the entire burden of those expansion costs on your existing customer base. So you're kind of protecting your existing customers by charging the system development charge. That money is being set aside to be used for future, so growth paying for growth. So that's kind of the idea behind that. I know you have I think what you call a connection fee currently for water and sewer. So water, I think it's $1,000 if I remember right. I have it in here. Water is, so for a 1 inch or smaller meter, connection fee is $3,000, and then that goes up based upon the larger meter size. For sewer, I believe that's the $1,000 one. Yeah. So 3/4 inch meter or smaller, it's $1,000, and then it escalates or increases based on larger meter sizes. Now, so the question I would have, first of all, is what costs are you recovering for that fee? So is that an actual tap fee, or was that originally intended to be sort of like an availability fee or system development charge?
I don't know the original intent. Please correct me if I don't describe this correctly. Primarily what we're collecting is the cost of the meter and our tap expenses. I don't believe much, if any of it, is set aside as a system development fee. That's where we're lacking.
Okay, so you've got kind of the tap side of it covered, right? And you can have two charges. So you can have a tap fee, which covers the physical, and you can have sort of this system development fee, which is in addition to that. So you can have both of those. What we would recommend is if you're considering doing a system development charge is that you have that charge calculated, and there is a methodology behind that. We're accountants, we like accounting methodologies. But essentially what it does in a nutshell is we look at the value of your asset, the value of your sewer system, or the value of your water utility. And we calculate how much that is essentially like, say, per gallon. And so if you have then that translates into a charge for each different meter size. So, it's very common to have a system development charge that is, $1,000 or $1,500 for a 5/8 inch, 3/4 inch connection. And then that increases based upon larger meter size, so that where you really see the benefit is if you have a significant commercial or industrial customer come in. Those can amount to sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars that you collect by way of system development fees. So Mr. Sheridan and I had kind of been talking about that, so we just kind of wanted to bring that concept up to you here tonight for discussion purposes, and also, if that's something that you're interested in establishing, we can help you go through that type of calculation.
Anything else? Thank you all very much for all your time. We do have an executive session. I've got folks waiting patiently. Thank you, Mr. Rao.
My pleasure, and thank you for your time, and I'm sorry that went a little long. I know it's a lot to cover, so.
It was necessary.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Questions? We need a motion to go to executive session.
Make a motion, we head into executive session.
Thank
Finger.
Aye.
you.